Hello, welcome to the Comic Book Commentary. I'm Bo Leidig, and this week we're going to be diving back into a series we haven't looked at in some time with Codename Stryke Force number 2. So let's zoom in and take a closer look. First published in March of 1994, we see here on the cover that it is kind of busy. We have Death's Angel, which I still believe is one of the dumbest names ever for a villain, standing in the middle, kind of blocking off some of the Stryke Force header, which I think is a bad idea in this case, given that this is only issue number 2. So it's not as if people are super used to seeing this book on the shelf. And also, there was a pretty big jump in time from issue number 1 to issue number 2, as they did not get this out in only a month's time. So not only are you blocking the logo of a book that only has one issue and people aren't super used to looking for, it's coming out late on top of that. So you're only making it harder for potential customers to find this book and buy it. And as I stated, the entirety of this cover does seem kind of busy, and I don't even think that the image is that bad. Like, it's actually well drawn, and it completely makes sense in terms of what the subject matter is and how it pertains to what goes on in the interior story of this book. But unfortunately, it just feels like a visual mess in some aspects. I mean, again, everything fundamentally should work, but there's just something about it that feels just busy and confusing when you look at it on the shelf. Art, Brandon Peterson. Co-plot, script, Mark Silvestri. Letters, Chris Eliopoulos. Colors, Joe Chiodo. Co-plot, editor, David Wohl. Computer colors, Brian Haberlin, Tyson Wengler II. Film output, Clydeen Nee, I think is how you say that. I could be wrong. If I am, I apologize. And in color, color assist, Monica Benet, Wendy Fouts, Paige Applebaum. Production, Dennis Heisler. Editorial, Robin Lane, Annie DeSantis. The story picks up exactly where it left off at the end of issue number 1, where we see 2 missiles careening towards the small craft that jettisoned from the main craft, which contains Stryker and Tempest. Stryker immediately realizes that their craft has no way of evading, destroying, or withstanding the blast from these missiles, so he immediately orders Tempest, in the most belittling and sexist way that he can possibly come up with, to go out and take care of this, which is in line with Stryker's character as we've seen in the past. However, Tempest does not just take this, as she immediately calls him a jerk as she leaves the interior of the craft. And this is something that we're going to see further into the comic with her character, that she does not just roll over and, take whatever kind of sexist or bigoted is maybe not the right word, but just condescending tones of Stryker lying down. She often comes back at him with her own quips. And so this does portray her as, a more strong and independent character, and someone who's not just going to let someone else walk all over them. Also, we find out that Tempest's real name is actually Lane Quintana, so that's new information to us. And she, of course, has wind-based powers, as per her name, that she will use to great effect in just a moment. We then get a 2-page splash where we see Tempest use her powers to not only create a force field of sorts with air, wind, if you will, but she also uses them to deflect the explosion from the 2 missiles away from herself and the craft that Stryker is piloting. Stryker, in his narrative, does point out that she can actually use her powers to literally slice a tank in half or create an impenetrable shield the way that she's done here, showing that Tempest's powers are very impressive. Also, can we just take a moment to appreciate how good the coloring team working for Mark Silvestri was at this time? Their colors just pop in the most beautiful ways. We've seen it in Cyberforce. We're seeing it also here in Codename Stryke Force. Joe Chiodo and the team were just working color magic with these books, and you will never hear me compliment them enough as far as I'm concerned. They were just really knocking it out of the park with every issue they put together. As the dust settles, Stryker orders Tempest to get back into the craft as they only have a few moments before Death's Angel and the crew on the submarine realize that their craft has not been destroyed by the explosion of the two missiles. She hops back in and they immediately dive under the water as this craft is also submersible and make their way towards the submarine in an attempt to breach the submarine and take it over. Meanwhile, on the submarine itself, Death's Angel is reveling in what he believes is the defeat of his enemies. However, one of his crew members reminds him that the other craft that the smaller craft left from is still heading towards them. Now, keep in mind, Death's Angel and his crew believe that the small craft that contains both Stryker and Tempest was actually a missile. Death's Angel admits that this is something that needs to be dealt with, and he orders his crew member to launch the pods, which we see fire off multiples of from the submarine headed towards the target, which still contains Bloodbow, Black Anvil, and Killraiser. Also, I'd like to point out, I find this hilarious that the small craft that jettisoned off of the larger vehicle, which Stryker is piloting, is set up exclusively to be piloted by Stryker. As we can see, he's controlling a lever with his left hand, and in each of his three right hands, also controlling some sort of lever to steer this craft, which makes no sense that you would design this so that only you could pilot it when you have a team of 4 other people that you're working with. But I do appreciate the comedy that I believe was unintentionally created by drawing it in this manner. We then see the rocket pods break through the surface of the water and then soar through the air as they prepare to intercept the target. Meanwhile, on the ship, which is the target, Bloodbow states that Stryker and Tempest were successful in getting into the water, but that they also need to hurry up with their mission, because if they can't knock out the sonar and radar capabilities of the submarine, the rest of the crew here are just sitting ducks with no way of really repelling any major attacks coming from the sub. He then asks Killraiser, hey, what do you think, Killer? Are they going to make it in time? And this is where we find from Black Anvil that Killraiser just never speaks. And he even states that in the 2 years he's been working with Killraiser, he's never heard him utter a single word. However, at this point, the radar on their ship starts going crazy, and Bloodbow notices the barrage of rockets coming towards them and realizes that they're in trouble. As they prepare to try and shoot these rockets out of the air, they're surprised when the rockets suddenly burst open and all of these jetpack-wearing shock troops just burst out of them to attack the ship, which, I mean, I can't believe that this, which was supposed to be the world's most advanced submarine ever, would have these types of weapons on board. Like, hey, we're just going to launch troops in rocket pods into midair and give them jetpacks and pistols, folks, not like, you know, hardcore superpowered rifles. No, pistols. This is what they're carrying. And this is somehow going to be an effective tactic from the world's most advanced submarine, which is supposed to operate in deep sea operations. It's hilarious. I mean, don't get me wrong. I get it. It's a comic book, and this is exactly the kind of thing you would expect to happen in a comic book. Just complete disregard for logic and just action, action, action. But man, you're really reaching with this one, in my opinion. Meanwhile, back under the surface, we see that Stryker and Tempest are continuing to make their approach on the submarine as they have been given plans, apparently, on what some of the sub's capabilities are and are approaching in their sonar blind spot. Tempest calls Stryker Chief as she tells him they're getting closer, which Stryker hates, but again, this goes back to Tempest not really taking any of his crap. She knows he hates being called Chief, and therefore she continues to do it because she wants him to know, you're not just going to roll over me like you tried to do. They immediately lock onto the side of the sub, and then Tempest uses her powers to cut a hole through the middle of the sub, which Stryker then uses his cybernetic arms to knock out of place. He then contacts Bloodbow and the rest of the gang and tells them that they have made their rendezvous point and are entering the sub to try and disable the sonar and radar capabilities. However, he does note in his narration that they're 3 minutes behind, which could be a real problem for their compatriots. Also, again, starting to get into the comic book feasibility factor, it does seem unreasonable that this is supposed to be the world's most advanced submarine in history, and it's already blown up 2 NATO warships and severely disabled and crippled an American aircraft carrier. But somehow, given all that and the entirety of all of the world's major navies not being able to locate this thing or do anything about it, Stryker and his band of mercenaries were able to, on the first try, not only locate where this submarine was at, but also make their approach and breach the hull of this sub with basically very little opposition from the sub itself and the crew inside. It just, again, you're very much trying to oversell how good Stryker and his team are. I get it, they're supposed to be amazing, but there's also a lot of other superhero teams that exist in the Image universe, and it does seem kind of crazy that this is supposed to be a world-level threat. And we haven't even heard of Stormwatch being involved or Youngblood. And instead, no, the US military and Navy is going to hire Stryker and his team to take care of this when they already have a superhero team in Youngblood to try and handle this exact type of event. And the UN also has their own superhero team to handle this exact type of an event. It really doesn't make sense in terms of like the overall plot as to why Stryker and his team would be involved in this. After knocking out the side of the submarine's hull, Stryker sticks his head inside and notices a group of enemy soldiers standing right below him, which makes zero sense because the piece of the hull that he knocked out should have landed right in the middle of them, or at the very least landed next to them and created a huge amount of noise and commotion which would have alerted them to Stryker's presence. However, none of that happened because comic book reasons. Stryker jumps down, opens fire, and takes out all of those crew members, and then immediately starts to make his way deeper into the ship. As he rounds a corner, he is actually kind of surprised at how little opposition he's faced. However, he doesn't notice that there's a shadowy figure approaching him from behind. This, of course, is one of the enemy crew members who immediately grabs him around the neck and orders all of his compatriots to start grabbing all of Stryker's arms. This, of course, does not bode well for Stryker as he is quickly overpowered by all of the men. However, this distraction does give Tempest an opportunity to proceed with her mission, which is to disable the sonar and the radar capabilities of the ship. But she does say that she hopes that Stryker's had enough time to create enough of a diversion to give her that opening. Back on the surface, a huge battle is ensuing as they're called here, Marauders swarm the ship and start getting the upper hand, as Bloodbow states that they must be using titanium rounds or something else that's ultra armor piercing, as they're taking out all of the ship's defenses and are also turning their armor into Swiss cheese. He then calls out to Black Anvil, but instead of calling him that, he calls him Percy, which is apparently his real name, and tells him they have to do something. Black Anvil apparently hates being called Percy and states that he's going to take care of this one way or another. As we see the jetpack-wearing mercenaries taking their toll on the ship, Black Anvil finally gets fed up and exits through a top hatch and decides to take matters into his own hands. As he exits the craft, he states to the attackers that he's had enough, and he jumps off the top of the craft, launches himself into them, taking out 3 in one shot, and then landing back on the craft once again. This, of course, is quite impressive. Unfortunately, they're not out of hot water just yet. He looks back into the craft and states that all of their guns have been disabled and that they need a plan. Killraiser immediately knows what to do, and he has signaled to Black Anvil that they're going to use a move that he saw in a comic book once, as Black Anvil then proceeds to use the fastball special, which is traditionally used by Colossus and Wolverine, and throws Killraiser directly into the oncoming enemies as he slices them near in half with the blades that jut out of his arm. Personally, I don't really like this when they're just objectively taking a gimmick from another more popular book and using it in their own. Like, you have a whole host of original characters and an original story here, and I get it. Like, a lot of the early Image was just poking the bear when it came to Marvel references, but this seems unnecessary and petty in a lot of ways. There was no reason for you to just be like, yeah, I used to work on X-Men, so I'm going to have my comic use a patented X-Men move within it. Like, it just, there's no reason for it. You could have come up with something else that would have worked splendidly, especially given how unique a cast of characters you have here. Why take a whole page, basically, of your book to just kind of be like, see, we can do the same thing as you? Yeah, no kidding, man. But, like, you don't have to just be that petty about it. It's at this point that Bloodbow also joins the other two on top of the craft, meaning that there's now no one driving it. Now, assumedly, this thing is high-tech enough that it has some sort of autopilot, but it's never mentioned. He immediately releases 2 arrows with a single draw of his bow and takes out the last 2 of the attacking enemy soldiers. However, he reminds the other 2 members of the team that they are not out of hot water just yet, as their craft has taken quite a bit of damage, and he's worried as to whether or not they're going to be able to get to the rendezvous point to meet back up with Stryker and Tempest. And speaking of Stryker, back under the surface, Stryker comes to realize that he has been captured and is now bound on his knees in front of Death's Angel. Death's Angel mocks him, stating that, the day is won on his end and that there's nothing Stryker and his team will be able to do. Stryker remains defiant, but Death's Angel only smiles as he begins to tell Stryker that they've already sent out an attack squadron to take care of the rest of his team, as one of Death's Angel's subordinates has run into the room to state that they're all dead. This brings an even bigger smile to Death's Angel's face as he starts to gloat, believing that the day is won in his favor. However, at this point, his subordinate reminds him, or I guess not reminds him, but interjects, stating, no, it's our men who are all dead. This infuriates Death's Angel as he immediately becomes enraged, and Stryker takes the opportunity to throw it in his face and gloat a little, stating that he needs to return to whatever supervillain school he dropped out of. Death's Angel is by no means amused as he immediately punches Stryker in the face and then tells his subordinate to go back to the bridge and take care of this immediately. In another part of the submarine, we see Tempest has finally made her way to the sonar/radar room and is quite surprised to see that there's only 2 men standing guard and believes that this should be easy enough. We also see that the craft is speeding just above the surface of the water as it continues to approach the submarine. At this point, another crew member contacts Death's Angel and tells him of the craft's approach. Death's Angel has decided that he is tired of playing games and tells his subordinate to launch a full-on ballistic assault at the craft and destroy it. Meanwhile, we see that Tempest has immediately taken out the 2 guards and entered the room. She now, however, has the task of trying to reprogram all of the radar and sonar to make sure that it doesn't target any of her friends. However, she's surprised to see that the technology has been modified inside of this sub and does not match up to the schematics that she's seen. So she wonders exactly what she has to do now in order to reprogram everything, and realizes also that she has to hurry because if she doesn't, her friends are all going to perish. Back on the surface, Black Anvil starts to panic as he looks at the radar and sees that there are loads of incoming bogies. We then see a full barrage of missiles hurling through the air at the craft, and at this point, Bloodbow realizes that Stryker and Tempest were unable to disable the targeting computers, and they're out of options, as he looks over at Killraiser and Black Anvil and simply states, "It's been nice knowing you guys, sort of." However, at this point, all of the missiles start to go haywire and just start going crazy through the air, launching into each other, exploding for no reason. And they realize that their friends have in fact accomplished their mission. And this is because Tempest decided that rather than trying to reprogram any of the computers that she didn't understand, that she should instead just follow Stryker's directive, and when you don't have any other options, trash the place. which is exactly what she does as she uses her wind powers to destroy all of the computers in the room. Unfortunately, she does not notice that she's been approached from behind by an enemy and is struck in the back of the neck with some sort of energy blast. Later on, the rest of the crew managed to get under the surface and approach the submarine, which no longer has any type of sonar capabilities or ways to detect any incoming bogeys, and attach onto the mini craft that was used by Stryker and Tempest to gain access to the sub. Once they dock onto it, they then enter the mini craft and then go through the exact same hole that Stryker used to get onto the ship that was made by Tempest. They start to look around and get their bearings, trying to figure out where the rest of their team is at, when there's a sudden explosion that happens from behind them and knocks all of them out. We then see that the other three start to come to and notice a familiar silhouette. And this is because they have also been captured and placed in the exact same room as Stryker, as we see the entire team is now bound and on their knees in front of Death's Angel, who gloats and states, "You should all consider yourselves lucky that I've allowed you to live this long." However, Stryker fires back, stating, "Well, exactly why are you being so generous?" And Death's Angel informs him, as he points to a vid screen, that he wants them to witness the destruction of New York City, which is the next part of his master plan. And this is where we reach the end of the issue. Unfortunately for us, we have no idea why Death's Angel is doing any of this, as none of his motivations have been explained up until this point. He's not given any kind of ransom notice to the world's governments. He's not explained that he's trying to conquer the planet in any way. He really just seems to be someone who's out to create chaos and mass destruction for no real reason other than just the sheer joy of it. This, of course, could not be the case, and it might be that he does want to conquer the world or is out for some sort of monetary gain. But we don't know because it's not been expressed in any way. We then see an advertisement for issue number 3 of Stryke Force, where we see Black Anvil in a black and white image riding on top of a nuclear bomb. Now, for those of you who don't know, this is a direct reference to the movie Dr. Strangelove, which, if you've never seen, I suggest you watch, because sadly, it's just as poignant today as it was when it was made. And you'll understand what I mean by that if you go and watch it. And I certainly hope that while it is poignant and it is expressing a lot of very important topics, that it never comes to pass in the way that it's portrayed. We then reach the letter section, which at this point does not actually have a title as of yet, and some of the letters are a little bit interesting. One reader actually compliments the writing of Stryke Force. Now, I will agree with him in the sense that Mark Silvestri actually does a pretty good job with the dialogue, especially given that this is actually the first time that he has ever taken on the full writing responsibilities for a book. However, as I've kind of pointed out throughout this video, there's a lot of plot holes. The story seems to suffer in many ways. And, you know, even though he didn't write the Cyberforce miniseries, you could say a lot of those same criticisms about the Cyberforce miniseries. The plot was very lacking in a lot of ways, and the same unfortunately holds true for Codename Stryke Force. Again, the dialogue is actually pretty good. It seems very natural, the banter between characters and the way that they speak to one another, and none of it seems like stilted or stiff. But again, it needs to have a better overall plot and story for that dialogue to be paired with. And unfortunately, at this point, that doesn't seem to be something that Mark is excelling at. Now, in another letter response, Wall, who is the one that's responding to all this, does admit that they have yet to reveal any of what Death's Angel's actual plans are, which I'm glad that he's actually bringing that up, because it did seem weird to me as I was reading not only the first issue, but all through this issue as well, that you have the main villain of this story arc just being a villain for the sake of being a villain, apparently, because you're not revealing anything about his actual plan or motivations. Now, I understand they plan on addressing this in the future. Unfortunately, it's kind of confusing in the first two issues to not have any clue as to why this guy is doing any of the things he's doing. And it just feels like a little bit amateurish in the way it's portrayed and presented. Again, this is Mark's first time writing a book on his own, so I understand you have to be patient with him in the sense that he's trying something new for the first time. But I feel like had he sat down with some other writers, he could have maybe fleshed this out a little bit better in a way that made more sense to us reading the book and not leave so many questions unanswered that should have been addressed at least to some degree in the first two issues. And then he also explains that the reason Mark is not responding to any of the letters in this column is because at this point, he just frankly doesn't have time. He's still drawing Cyber Force while writing Codename Stryke Force and making all sorts of other public appearances while trying to run several different projects all at the same time. And that at this point, while he does read a lot of the letters, he just doesn't have the time to respond to them, which is understandable. At this juncture, he's just gotten to a point where he's got too many irons in the fire to be trying to respond to fan letters in both Cyber Force and Stryke Force. We then get Image info. Of course, this is just a little blurb about what was going on in Image Comics and upcoming books. Nothing really to talk about here. And then an advertisement for the Spawn Batman team-up comic, which at some point or another, I'm going to have to make a video about it. I have it, of course. I just haven't gotten around to it. But stay tuned. I will get to it eventually. I'm just trying to get my bearings and get a lot of other things out as I'm struggling to make sure that all of these books kind of line up where they're supposed to in terms of when they were originally released, while also making sure that I'm getting miniseries out where they should appear in the storyline. It's actually a lot more difficult than I thought it was going to be back when I started this channel. We then get an advertisement for Wizard Magazine, issue number 33, as well as the Kindred miniseries. I'm pretty sure I have all of Kindred, as I've spoken in the past about, and I do plan on making videos about the Kindred miniseries when I get to the point in Wildcats and Stormwatch where this miniseries is happening. So stay tuned for that. It will be coming in the future. We then get an advertisement for Shadowline's new posters, which is obviously a comedic take on the Maxell advertisements of this time period, if you're old enough to remember those. And I gotta say, while I've never seen any of these posters, I am very disappointed that I have never seen this Shadowhawk poster because I would absolutely have it hanging on my wall right now. And then we get an advertisement for Freak Force. I have not reached the point in the Super Patriot / ongoing Savage Dragon series where Freak Force breaks off as its own comic, but when I do, I will start making videos about Freak Force, so stay tuned for those in the future. We then see an advertisement for Images of Tomorrow, where Stormwatch number 25 actually ships 15 months early and is available in May of 1994. Which was a really weird idea that they were going to ship issue number 25 way ahead of schedule. And I guess it's supposed to be a future tale. We're going to get into all that on my Stormwatch videos. So if you're into that and would like to know more about this when it happens, tune into my Stormwatch videos. And if you'd like to know more about Stormwatch, you can check it out in my Stormwatch playlist. And on the reverse inside cover, we get an advertisement for Bow and Board, which was a service where you could order autographed books, graded books, all sorts of stuff, pieces of artwork that were signed by different artists. I don't recall if Bow and Board still exist. I can't remember off the top of my head. But if they do, I might check them out at some point and see what they're up to these days. And that was Codename Stryke Force number 2. And I'm kind of torn on this issue. I really enjoy the characters of Marc Silvestri, whether they be Cyber Force or Codename Stryke Force. And this book does have a lot of things going for it. The pencils are pretty good. The colors are spectacular. The dialogue works very well. It's very action-packed and engaging. But there's just a lot of points where the plot is an absolute mess to try and understand. And there are so many different plot holes that just kind of don't make sense. And the idea that we're 2 issues into this book and we still have no clue as to why the villain of this story is doing any of the things he's doing is really kind of weird. I don't know. I just feel like Mark knew what he was doing in terms of artwork. And honestly, he really kind of knew what he was doing in terms of dialogue as well. But in terms of like actually putting together a cohesive narrative and thinking about how a plot was going to play out over multiple issues, he still seems to struggle with that at this point, at least in my opinion. But then again, that is just my opinion. And your opinion may be that he was doing A-okay and all of this made perfect sense and I'm just complaining about nothing. And if that's the case, it's okay because everyone's entitled to their own opinions. If you enjoyed today's video, please feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. And thanks for stopping by. Have a great day.